3:03 in the morning, a decommissioned Dell PowerEdge blade server in rack 14 started drawing 74 watts of continuous power. That machine had been air-gapped and flagged for disposal 6 months earlier. It sat in the basement forensics lab of the RCMP Integrated Division, building out past Milton, just off Highway 401. I was on the overnight rotation, mostly running routine hash checks on seized drives and drinking terrible institutional coffee out of a styrofoam cup. The lab was quiet. Just the hum of the HVAC trying to keep the server racks at 17 degrees Celsius, and the faint shudder of transport trucks out on the highway whenever their Jake brakes kicked in. I noticed the server because of a power monitoring script we ran to catch failing cooling units. When I pulled up the internal switch logs, the machine wasn't just idling. It was routing outbound encrypted traffic through an auxiliary port that should have been physically disabled with a plastic lock. My first thought wasn't panic. It was annoyance. I assumed some Tier 2 contractor from Shared Services Canada had done a sloppy decom job, left a bridge cable plugged in, and an automated script on an outside host was attempting a basic brute force crawl against our subnet at 3 in the morning. The digital forensics lab in Newmarket is completely silent. It's located in the basement of the regional detachment, past 2 badge access security checkpoints, a heavy steel fire door, and an air-gapped intake room where seized hardware sits in anti-static bags. I was finishing an overtime shift, analyzing a clone of a server taken from a logistics warehouse in Vaughan. It was standard financial fraud triage. Nothing high priority. Just 16 terabytes of encrypted freight manifests and driver logs that I had set to batch process while I drank cold coffee. At 3:03 a.m., the internal network gateway flashed an alert. Our lab network is air-gapped from the public internet. We operate on a restricted provincial internet with strict packet logging, monitored constantly by our technical services team in Ottawa. When an outbound handshake triggers an alert at that hour, it usually means someone left a consumer laptop plugged into an unauthorized Ethernet drop, or a scheduled diagnostic script failed. I pulled up the switch diagnostics to see which port generated the packet. The traffic wasn't coming from any of the active analysis workstations. It was registered to an IP assigned to Rack 4, Bay 12. I stood up, walked past the rows of server cabinets, and found Bay 12. It contained an old PowerEdge unit that had been marked with red physical evidence tape and decommissioned 14 months earlier after a joint task force operation in Hamilton. The unit had no patch cables connected to its front panel. The power supply switch on the rear was flipped off. Back at my console, the switch was registering an active data transfer of roughly 4 megabits per second over that exact port. My first thought was that the switch management software had corrupted its ARP table, or that someone had cross-wired a patch panel during the network refresh 3 weeks prior. That kind of human error happens more often than people realize, especially when regional facilities contract out cabling maintenance to third-party vendors. I opened a command terminal to trace the MAC address directly from the core switch. The MAC address didn't belong to any commercial vendor in our database. It resolved to a virtual interface running on an internal network loop. Someone hadn't broken into our system from outside. The traffic was originating from within our own local network segment, routing outbound through a legacy telecommunications trunk that the building had inherited from the Ontario Provincial Police back in 2011. I killed the switch port remotely. The interface closed immediately, but the data rate on the master gateway didn't drop. Instead, it jumped to 18 megabits. The data wasn't trying to leave our building to reach an external server. It was using our secure, air-gapped routing tables as a relay point between two completely separate external connections. Someone had installed a hidden software bridge on our internal network, effectively turning our law enforcement forensics lab into a clean, unmonitored proxy node for outside traffic. I pulled up the packet inspector and ran a brief packet capture, filtering for plain text headers. Most of it was heavily scrambled using layered encryption I didn't recognize. But nested inside the transport layer were operational telemetry logs, automated license plate reader data from Highway 401, live status reports from shipping containers moving through the Port of Montreal, and municipal traffic camera feeds from Peel region. None of those feeds were part of my investigation. None of them were part of any case our Newmarket team had ever worked on. They were being routed through our secure subnet because traffic coming out of an RCMP forensics facility is automatically whitelisted by provincial telecom firewalls. No commercial security tool scans packets originating from our domain. We were the blind spot. I reached for the landline on my desk to call the duty officer in Ottawa. Before I could lift the receiver, my primary monitor flickered. A local command prompt window opened in the center of my screen. There was no user input from my keyboard. The prompt didn't execute a script. It didn't try to lock the drive or demand a ransom. A single line of text appeared in the terminal, a simple, clean, non-standard system icon, followed immediately by my personal street address in Barrie. Below that, a string of 10 digits appeared, the exact serial number on the physical access keycard hanging from the lanyard around my neck. The terminal window closed itself 2 seconds later. The transfer rate on the network gateway dropped instantly to 0. The switch logs cleared their buffers. When I tried to pull the crash dump from the core router, the entire log directory showed as empty, showing a last modified timestamp of 2:45 a.m., 18 minutes before the alert had even started. I spent the remaining 4 hours of my shift writing a formal critical incident report. I detailed the switch anomaly, the ghost traffic on Bay 12, the unmonitored trunk line, and the terminal event. At 7:30 a.m., the technical services lead came in. We walked down to the server room together. pulled the casing off the decommissioned server in Bay 12. Inside, spliced directly into the motherboard's auxiliary power connector behind the drive bay, was a low-draw cellular relay module with a hardwired connection tapped into the back of the physical patch panel. It hadn't been installed remotely. Someone had physically unscrewed the casing, placed the module inside the chassis, and patched it into the facility's infrastructure by hand. The module had no serial numbers. The SIM card slot was empty. It was running on an embedded ESIM with a non-routable profile. By noon, 2 senior technical investigators from division headquarters arrived. They took the module, mirrored my workstation drive, and took my written statement. They told me it was likely an orphan testing unit left over from a federal infrastructure vulnerability assessment conducted 2 years earlier that hadn't been properly logged. They told me the address on my screen was probably a cached credential leak caused by a faulty browser profile sync from my work phone. 3 days later, I was reassigned to administrative fraud intake at the downtown Toronto office. My incident report never appeared in the division's monthly security review. The official internal record shows that on that Tuesday morning, the Newmarket Forensics Lab